Summer Davos 2024 was held a few weeks ago, and it was barely covered by anyone, except for a few independent outlets. Legacy media did not touch it at all, and I guess I'm not surprised. Anyway, this event was held in China, which I thought was pretty interesting. Because really, all of our global leaders seem to admire China's totalitarianism. They openly talk about it. A few examples include Justin Trudeau.
He was asked which country he most admired and referred to China.
There's a level of admiration I actually have for China because their basic dictatorship is allowing them to actually turn their economy around on a dime and say we need to go green as fast as we need to start investing in solar. I mean, there is a flexibility that I know Stephen Harper must dream about of having a dictatorship that he could do everything he wanted. That I find quite interesting.
Or, of course, Klaus Schwab, claiming that the future of the world looks like China.
The World Economic Forum has been involved in China since 1979. And we have been part of the development of this country now for nearly 30 years.
I respect China's achievements, which are tremendous over the last over 40 years. I think it's a role model for many countries. The Chinese model is certainly a very attractive model for quite a number of countries.
We have been part of the development of this country now for nearly 30 years.
From smart city surveillance to QR coding humans, digital IDs, social credit scores, 15-minute cities, and travel restrictions. All of that has been deployed over there already. And the West, they look on with envy. They want to model their own technocratic systems after China. And if the world follows suit, well, it's not going to be too pretty for us. But alas, that's if they succeed. They won't. You gotta have some faith. There's many aspects to this agenda that a lot of people believed were, inevitable. Well, now they're struggling to be born. And that's simply because we are winning the arguments. Now, I just recently started to read about the rise of China, so let me know if I'm off base. But many books have been written about this subject, and as far as I can tell, they all seem to underestimate the US role in making this happen. Essentially, they developed that nation at the expense of their own citizens. This happened throughout the 70s, 80s, and 90s. For example, our political class opened up their markets, losing entire industries to them on purpose, and pressed other nations to make similar moves. They brought them into the World Trade Organization. They co-founded both of China's most prominent universities. They allowed China to steal intellectual property without sanction, essentially giving them free rein to copy US companies. They allowed China to sell their own products but banned American-made products, and provided almost all direct foreign investments in China for well over 2 decades. So basically, without the United States, China's quote-unquote miracle would have never even happened. If only Nixon did not help in 1972. If only Jimmy Carter did not prop them up in 1979. If only Bill Clinton did not sell us out in 1993, 96, and 2000. I mean, have you heard of Chinagate? It's rarely talked about, but Bill Clinton accepted campaign contributions from Chinese officials in exchange for the transfer of US military technology. Yes, it was all about cheap products and developing US consumerism. They destroyed American manufacturing to get it done, and on top of that, they built up their military too. Scandalous indeed. A great quote from Dave Smith applies here. If you want to know who's going to be our future enemy, look at who we are funding right now. It applies to every conflict in recent history. It happens pretty much every damn time. Anyway, I just thought that was worth noting, but let's jump into Summer Davos. The event unfolded with 6 major topics: a global new economy, China and the world, entrepreneurship in the age of AI, new frontiers for industries, investing in people and connecting climate, and then nature and energy. One big aspect of this was, of course, monetizing nature. And for this, let's jump over to Tim Hinchliffe. He's always on top of these events and puts out great articles about them, so I'm going to leave a link to his website in the comments. So, yes, monetizing nature. It's their ultimate goal. Check out this clip right here.
And beyond carbon, let's think about other aspects of nature that are easier to quantify. We probably will not be able to quantify everything on day one, but what about water? Right? That's also quite possible for us to start integrating systematically into current trading carbon pricing mechanisms.
And I quote, "Beyond carbon taxes, let's think about other aspects of nature that are easier to quantify. What about water? Man, these people are something else. Psychos. If you remember, I showed this clip a few weeks ago. They openly lamented the fact that climate change was not working to change our behavior, and perhaps they could use the subversion of water systems as a method of persuasion. They say, and I quote, "Because everyone understands how important water is, even children," end of quote.
Only as healthy as our neighbor is on our street, in our city, in our region, in our nation, and globally. And did we solve that? Like, did we actually manage to vaccinate everyone in the world? No. So highlighting water as a global commons and what it means to work together and see it both out of that kind of global commons perspective, but also the self-interest perspective, because it does have that parallel. It's not only important, but it's also important because we haven't managed to solve those problems which had similar attributes. And water is something that people understand. You know, climate change is a bit abstract. Some people understand it really well. Some understand it a bit. Some just don't understand it. Water, every kid knows how important it is to have water. When you're playing football and you're thirsty, you need water. So there's also something about really getting citizen engagement around this and really, in some ways, experimenting with this notion of the common good. Can we actually deliver this time in ways that we have failed miserably other times? And hopefully we won't keep failing on the other things, but anyway.
As I said, they are insane. All of this can and should be considered an act of self-harm. The plan is to make everybody poor and dependent on the government, and by taxing every aspect of life, they siphon off your wealth systematically. They love to use, euphemisms for this. They call it the service economy or circular economy. You're going to hear those phrases quite a bit in the future. However, in reality, all this means is the end of private ownership as a whole. Why would you want to own anything at all, they say. They were not kidding when they said you'll own nothing and be happy, except for the happy part. They were definitely kidding about that. Now this is multifaceted and a bit complicated to explain because it ties into multiple different programs. So basically they want to barcode all living organisms and of course natural resources to create a monetary taxation system off of that. Monetizing nature. Yeah, it's quite literal.
So central banks are also starting to understand nature has real value. Carbon we already figured out, and carbon is moving very quickly into a system where it's going to be very close to a currency. Basically being able to take a ton of absorbed or sequestered carbon and being able to create a forward pricing curve with financial service architecture, documentation. I just came out of a meeting this morning how we're trying to accelerate that. To be quite honest, not to get very boring, but we're on financial topics and things, but they're going to be derivatives. And you need ISDA documentation if you want to trade a derivative in the marketplace. And all of this actually matters for nature as well. I'm going to quickly hand off, but again, I want to talk about value one more time because the southern part of the world has value far greater than large elements of the northern part. And when we start thinking about and putting prices on water, on trees, on biodiversity, we find where does that sit? I'm doing a lot of work out of Asia, and I say that my next door neighbor, Indonesia, is the left lung of the world, and obviously Brazil's the right. And Africa, absolutely critical, and we need their natural capital as a system-based world more than we need that 66 billion we've got sitting in the basement of the Bank of England. So how do we, and I'm hoping this discussion today, at least from a central banker's point of view, on how do we start tokenizing, how do we start building systems that actually create not only the value, but transfer that value around the world.
With their stakeholder capitalism economic model, they claim Mother Nature will be the key stakeholder, which is not true at all. They want to subvert Mother Nature and use it to control the masses. Would you like more proof of this? No problem. Let's jump to this panel right here. And I quote, "Bring nature onto the balance sheet because we cannot do business on a dead planet." End of quote. Unelected globalists want to put a price on everything in nature, from the water we drink to the air we breathe. And yes they do. However, from there, we have Lindsay Hooper of the World Economic Forum, who says this.
But the ways, as you said, the ways in which we have grown our economies, our models of economic development, have been incredibly successful for global prosperity. But the unintended consequences of current models of growth are simply not sustainable on a finite planet.
And I quote, "The ways in which we have grown our economies have been incredibly successful for global prosperity. The unintended consequences of current models of growth are simply not sustainable on a finite planet." End of quote. So, yeah, if models for growth are not sustainable, that means that economic degrowth is the only acceptable option. And that is exactly what their model for economics is based upon. Again, as I said before, it was not an accident that they decided to go with the slogan, "You'll own nothing." They want you poor and living under their thumb. It's technological serfdom, to save the planet, of course. Another key aspect is controlling food systems. However, it's not only about the adage, control the food, control the people. There's something more happening too. You might have heard about how the US political class has been trying to fleece American farmers out of their land. For example, some sketchy things have been taking place in Idaho. They are systematically weakening claims to farmland, and it's very similar to what they've been doing in places like the Netherlands. Anyway, as I was saying, there's another reason besides just control the food, control the people. It's actually to run their technocratic system, because in order to do that, they need massive data hubs. And for that, they need land with access to water. So yeah, starting to see the connection yet? Yeah, developed agricultural land would do the trick. Which in turn is another reason they want to move food production to giant Bill Gates funded labs. They never seem to tell you the truth. All of this has nothing to do with the environment. It's all about controlling the people and running the infrastructure for this dystopian technocratic society. And they are not giving up on these ideas, as you can see. However, they will not succeed. You are winning this. We just have to keep bringing awareness to these topics. The fact is, more and more people are seeing it for what it is, that's for sure. The entire plan can be summed up here by Josh Walkos. Now, I'm adding a little bit to this, but the point remains the same. Quantify as much as they can in the natural world so they can tax you for it. Tax you for simply being alive. Essentially, after monetizing nature, they'll own the earth and all of its wonders. And then, of course, they're going to relegate you to the label of planetary enemy. After all, you are the carbon that's destroying it, right? Yes, that's right. It's right out of the Club of Rome's playbook. So, do you happen to remember this? You should, because it details pretty much their entire agenda. The First Global Revolution was a book written in 1991 by Alexander King and Bertrand Schneider. It's a sequel to the 1972 book, The Limits to Growth, which of course kicked off Agenda 21 and Agenda 2030. However, on page 115, they describe their plan to unite humanity with a common enemy. And yes, that common enemy is humanity itself. And the ploy is climate messaging. And I quote, "In searching for a new enemy to unite us, we came up with the idea that pollution, the threat of global warming, water shortages, famine, and the like would fit the bill. All of these dangers are caused by human intervention, and it is only through changed attitudes and behavior that they can be overcome. The real enemy then is humanity itself." End of quote. So, are you starting to see the vision? Yeah. The foundation to their entire ideology is that you are an enemy to life itself. And that kind of seems like foreshadowing to me, because what typically happens to, enemies? Yeah, not good. Another major focus of Summer Davos was of course AI. One panel declared that 99% of all intelligence will be artificial. Artificial intelligence will transform decision making, they say. But there's one big problem with that. Artificial intelligence is always going to be utilitarian. If killing humans is determined to have the best result based on data analysis and the aggregate well-being of the population, and/or the completion of a goal, well, artificial intelligence is going to execute that command. No nuance, no empathy, no way to consider certain outside or unknown factors. Individual rights have no standing in the algorithm. It's all about the group. Not a good path forward, that's for sure. After all, the quote-unquote greater good is called the murderer's solace for a reason. Alright, so you're going to find a link to that website, Sociable, in the comments, and yeah. He's been dealing with other outlets, outright stealing his work recently, so I'd appreciate it if you just show him some support. And on top of that, you're going to find many more details in there too, so it's worth it. And so, before we move on to the Epstein story, I want to show you something interesting, or disturbing, depending on how you look at it. And for this one, let's jump over to another great account to follow, Conspiratorial Report. And I quote, 16 lab-grown brains run the world's first living computer in Switzerland. Yeah, they are creating what they call biocomputers or bioprocessors, and are now growing brain cells in labs. So yeah, keep that haunting story in mind, because when you add it to this, well, you might have a few nightmares. Scientists are using human skin cells to create more relatable faces for robots. Yeah, they're growing brain cells for biocomputers and using human skin cells so robots can appear more human and can also show fake emotions. Yeah, not that great. It's a terrifying future in which we'll all have that uncanny valley feeling 24/7. Which brings me to this. Oddly enough, the first time I saw this, it kind of stuck in my head. And I quote, "One of the most frightening things I've ever heard is when someone pointed out that the existence of Uncanny Valley implies that at some point there was an evolutionary reason to be afraid of something that looked human, but wasn't." Yeah, well, with the way things are going, that's gonna come in handy in the very near future. And the reason is because with this kind of technology coming out, we're all gonna end up having that Uncanny Valley feeling all the time, 24/7. So, something to look forward to. Alright, so I just want to finish up and talk about Epstein for a moment. A bunch of documents and videos have been released. This one was pretty interesting to say the least. From Ken Silva, and I quote, "One of his victims testified that Epstein bragged about being a Mossad agent," which, for those paying attention, we already knew, but I'd like to add some context. So, this trafficking ring and ties to Israeli intelligence go back to Ghislaine Maxwell's father, Robert. And Robert Maxwell's relationship with Mossad and the United States goes back to the Promise software scandal of the 1980s. Israel sold the United States software that had a backdoor into all critical systems. And so, in turn, the US government worked with Israel to sell that software to various Latin American countries. What a way to subvert and control them, huh? I mean, it's quite the story. And then from there, in those same documents, we have Epstein bragging about being a member of the Trilateral Commission and the Council on Foreign Relations, too. Apparently, he was a member of the Council on Foreign Relations from 1995 to 2009. And that means that right after he met with Bill Clinton at the White House, well, Epstein started to work with the CFR. That also means he was an active member even after his first conviction. You know that sweetheart deal that Alan Dershowitz got him back in 2006? Yeah, so he was still a member of the Council on Foreign Relations for another 3 years after that. But they say nobody knew. Yeah, okay. That is such a massive, massive lie that it's kind of comical if it wasn't so dark and twisted. So I'm going to go through all the rest of the Epstein revelations, and if there's something in there that's truly revelatory, I'll dedicate an entire video about it. I really do want to try to keep the Epstein saga in the forefront. We just can't let it slide. And that's because Epstein is kind of like a Rosetta Stone for political corruption. It goes from blackmail honeypot schemes being run by intel agencies, foreign government interference with our politicians, of course blackmail by foreign governments, but it also goes into financial crimes too. If we pull that Epstein thread, this whole corrupt scene could be unraveled. And just remember that you are alive at one of the most critical moments in human history, and I, for one, am glad you're here. Once again, this is HelioWave. If you like the content, like, comment, and subscribe. Share the video if you want to. If you're in a position to, consider subscribing on Locals, or you could use PayPal. Anyway, as always, make sure you disobey those true fascistas, and yes, I do hope you have a good night.